Mystical Musings Podcast.
Brenton and Rachelle here again,
Hey
coming back
everyone.
to have another little dharma talk here. And we want to talk about shadow work today.
I'm just going to launch into it, I guess. It's not something to be feared. All humans have shadow. And I think the challenge is what is to be feared is if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't work with it, if we don't face it, if we don't recognize it and recognize that we're actually meant to have shadow. That's part of our makeup.
Totally. Just like the makeup of the planet is literally half dark all the time. In
Yeah.
fact, we really think about it, most of the universe is dark. It's shadow, it's emptiness.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's kind of lay the foundation here. Like there's a lot of buzz around shadow work right now. I feel like on social media, I see that term shadow work is kind of going around. So what to you, like what is shadow work, and then maybe also what's not shadow work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, I want to hear what your take is on that too. For me, I would say shadow work is, in some ways, staring our demons in the face. You know, staring our difficult emotions, staring our difficult experiences in life straight in the face, and recognizing that our makeup, our mind, our body, our spirit is meant to process those and use that as the fertile ground for growth. So I would say that's what I consider shadow work to be. We're digging in the dirt with ourselves. What sort of counterpoint, what is not shadow work is, kind of throwing it away and acting as if there is no fear or there is no shame or there is no inadequacy or there is no loathing or whatever it is, insert whatever challenging emotion or experience you have. And that often comes up in two ways that I can name right now in this moment, which is spiritual bypass is one of them. I'm all good. It's all good. No fear here. No problem. Or toxic positivity is the other one. So yeah, I'm curious. What do you think about those, Brenton? What is shadow and what is not shadow work?
Yeah, I have to say it's really interesting to look at especially toxic positivity. But that kind of spiritual bypassing is similar. It's like fake brightness. It's like this kind of things are getting dark. Let's just kind of pretend like there's light, instead of like really kindling one inside. So yeah, I've worked with shadow work in some different ways. And as I've thought about it recently, my understanding of shadows has changed a lot. I think earlier in my spiritual journey, shadows were largely linked with fear. They were linked with the parts of myself that I thought were bad or wrong or needed to be fixed or healed. More and more as I age, as I work with people, as I work myself, I've begun to see shadows as more of just this kind of inseparable part of being in the physical world. And in some ways, I would even link shadows with karma or with learning, with this kind of built-in mechanism for navigating consciousness. And, we could talk about maybe that's why we're even here on a spiritual level, is to kind of work through some of that stuff as God experiencing itself in these multifaceted ways. But I think about kind of what we mentioned in the beginning about how the earth spends half of its time in shadow, and that maybe shadow work is more about the things that we just don't see clearly. It's about, and I love the analogy you gave about digging in the dirt. It makes me think of really digging into the dirt until we expose the roots, because shadow work is sometimes discovering I don't know, it's like it's the habits, it's the beliefs, it's the things that kind of happen in an unconscious way that bring us to this point of separation, this point of isolation, and not just like isolation from other people or community, but isolation from what's real inside, isolation from that spark of the divine. When it comes to what's not shadow work, actually, those were I didn't call it spiritual bypassing. Pretense was the word that came to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Or then the other one too. But yeah, that idea that, oh yeah, I have no shadows. Everything is fine. I have no fears. I'm just gonna fake it till I make it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a point where that comes into play, but not with shadow work.
Yeah, thanks. What you just said makes me think of one other piece where I would say maybe that's not shadow work. Sometimes, and it's often akin to this toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing, is rather than looking at ourselves and our blind spots and our challenges, we're looking at other people and saying, you have shadow there. You need to do work around that. That's also another way that it shows up, and that is not shadow work. We're not walking around telling other people what they need to look at. Now, there can be an agreement if you're stepping into a group or you're in a partnership, and there's respect and there's clear communication around that. Relationships are meant to help us see our own shadow, but walking around telling other people that they have shadow and you don't, that's not shadow work.
Definitely not. While, it's not to say that being in a group setting, maybe working with shadows like this is not a good reflective experience, but yeah, definitely not the spot it without admitting the got it.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I have to say, as I've been thinking about this, I think it's curious about how just we feel about shadows in general as humans. Because I've been thinking about just the way that shadows show up on the planet again, and depending on where we are and how comfortable or uncomfortable we are, sometimes shadows can look bright and shiny, kind of like what you mentioned. And my analogy is like on a hot
Mm.
summer day, we want shadows because they're cool. I like sitting in the shadows. We call it shade, right? If it's a nice day, unless we're throwing it at somebody, and then we call it throwing shade, right? So these shadows, they can be a a point of respite, or they can be something that we kind of hurl in terms of insults, kind of like don't pointing out other people's shadows things.
Right.
So it's interesting how we do that, and I'm curious about if maybe some of the fear around this inner work that we have sometimes is maybe because of this inherent fear of the dark, that fear of
Mm.
what we can't see. I wonder if you
Mm.
have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said. Yeah, there's a few things that come up. I'm gonna like dive deep here for a second, so excuse me, but yeah, fear of the dark, where I go with this. And I'll say that it's kind of like sedimentary rock when working with shadows. There's things that are on the surface, they're like pretty easy to be like, oh, there's my shadow right there. And then there's other things where it's directly behind us and it's pretty hard to see and really subtle. And it's built into relationships, it's built into our educational system, it's built into our society. And so I don't know if this is directly or not answering your question, but some of the things that I think about when really looking at deep shadow, deep unconscious, subtle layers of shadow, is going back to the idea of original sin. That's one of them, right? But so much of Western religion, and even if you don't subscribe to Western religion, we carry that in our DNA. That we're flawed, we're a failure, we've got this from the beginning. It human, and even especially women, right, carrying that. So that would be one that's pretty buried in there. And yeah, just belief systems and worldviews. Those are other ones that come into play, I think. Some other ones that come in relevance to along that like more global perspective is privilege and systemic oppression. Those are also shadows that we often have a hard time seeing. And that's a lot of what has been coming up in the last couple of years, sort of globally, where people are really starting to see that. And there's a lot of, kind of opposition and pushing and fighting around that.
What I hear you saying is it's almost like there's the more shadows that go unaddressed within each of us, the more they start to show up collectively.
Yeah, well
And
said.
and that's what I kind of hear, because like privilege is kind of that individual shadow, but then privilege collectively is systemic racism.
Mhm.
So it's like it's all the more reason to do our shadow work, right? And to not like conquer and slay them like dragons, although maybe sometimes that is what needs to happen. But I think most of the time it's more of a gentle and integrated process than that,
Yeah.
which we have a long way to go, because we're still very, on a societal level, it's very like go fight war kind of thing, when in fact it's about integration. It's about coming together, which is
Mhm.
what shadow work really is all about. Um, I do have to say, there was a point where, in my metaphysical studies, I went to a metaphysical school in the Midwest of all places. And as I've assimilated that, the 8 years that I spent there, there were a lot of very forward thinking, like out of the box practices and things that I learned. But there was this underlining current of Midwest spirituality, which is very, Baptist kind of Christian. And
Mm.
so even threaded throughout that exploration of soul and spirit, there was still this idea in the philosophies there of there being something incomplete inside of us that we were here to make whole again.
Mm.
And so it's like, maybe there's no greater shadow than belief in general.
Mm.
Because
Yeah.
belief really, think about how often we fight for beliefs, and whether we're talking about spiritual beliefs or political beliefs or individual belief, it's like people fight about the craziest things that they believe. But what does it really mean to know, to take this idea that I believe and then to become a knower with it, to become a
Mm.
practitioner of it, to shine the light to the point. So it's not just I believe it's scary out there in the dark, but when you turn on the lights, it's like, oh, actually, that was just a tree over there. It wasn't a monster or whatever it was.
Mhm.
So what are some examples of shadows that we all work with? We've kind of mentioned some of them, I mean, both individually and collectively. And maybe you could even talk about some of your shadows. I could talk about some of mine.
Yeah, maybe we can just kind of popcorn back and forth. I mean, some bigger ones are that are pretty pervasive, I would say, would be fear of death. And I think also like fear of radical living, fear of liberated living, fear of our own spirit are ones that are pretty big shadows. Fear in general is is a shadow, and it also doesn't have to be a shadow, right? So you were talking earlier about aspects of light can be shadow, and also aspects of darkness can be light. So there's some paradox here, which I love. That's the um, great work there. Yeah, I mean, inadequacy, I think, is one. Self-criticism and judgment is one that I see a lot in the people that I work with. I mean, I've said many times that um, inadequacy or not good enoughness is an epidemic in our Western world. There's probably many more.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I know many of those I experienced direct hand that you mentioned for sure.
Yeah.
Since I work with gene keys a lot, shadow work is kind of built into that work. And so the one that has been, or the several that have been kind of on my mind lately are half-heartedness or mediocrity, this kind of
Mm.
giving up or apathy kind of energy.
Mm.
But then also really exploring the shadow of desire, which in my
Mm.
mind is kind of like belief. At first hand, it's like, oh, belief is good, desire is good. They keep us moving and going and creating, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And also think about how entrapping desire can be. I mean, there's a reason all of these spiritual practices have said that when you become attached to things, it starts to give you a bad time.
Yeah, absolutely. And desire, taken a few steps down the road, then becomes addiction or becomes this kind of like malicious or malevolent striving that kind of has this own chaotic fire, uncontrolled energy of itself. I sometimes have felt that. Another one that I think is really big in Western society is that our personal value equals our productivity. That's a big one for me. It's like keeps me constantly going. Yeah.
Yeah, that doing is value.
Yep.
Yeah, what an insidious shadow that for all of gosh, from Gen X to Gen Z is, going to be just working with their entire lives, because of the way society is set up.
Absolutely. And I think that particular piece is getting worse. It's like there's no time for rest. There's no time for creativity. You can see it in our education system. They're eliminating all of these things that are associated with wellness and don't have, kind of gross national product. Is that what it's called? Yeah, where it's like there's this outcome that serves society, but there's an internal benefit, but that's something that's different. I often say to people, oh, we're never told, nobody at your work, unless it's at CSC, is going to say, yeah, you should take some time off, like take care of yourself. That in a, breakneck world, that rarely happens. And so we get this message, and that tends to be the unconscious piece, the shadow, right? It sits there and it's like, oh, I should be doing something else, not resting, not enjoying.
Yeah, so I'm kind of hearing these themes of shadows being related to both fears, to shoulds, to things that are like to placing authority outside of ourselves, placing trust, like just in other words, taking things and placing them outside of ourselves, whether it's trust, a sense of being, a sense of value, right? Separation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like how you're saying that. It also makes me think of expectations can be that too, whether it's other people's expectations or the internalized expectations that we often carry around with us. Yeah.
Totally. That's actually Gene Key 42. The shadow is expectation. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of what things that I appreciate about the Gene Keys is that Richard Rudd's perspective is that it's through walking shadows, through doing the shadow work, that our gifts are actually activated, that they come to the surface. And I think that that's not only profoundly fucking beautiful, but I think it's wildly true. So I wonder, maybe not I wonder. I guess I see the connection between that kind of approach and the fear that you talked about in the beginning. And how fear is often what holds us back from really going into the dark like that. So I'm curious, having done all the work that you have with not only yourself, but with other people, like what are some of the ways that help us to not be so afraid in venturing into the dark or into the unknown or into shadow work like that?
Yeah, I think, there's a number of ways. Certainly, studying or being exposed to the idea that we can do shadow work. Like that's not most of us weren't taught that. So that's one of the ways to dispel the fear around that it's out. This is part of the reason why it's a big movement, is because we have to get it out. We have to be able to look at it and be like, oh, this is normal. There's a story that I have to tell. And you probably have heard this story before, Brenton. There was, so I went to grad school at Naropa, and they had a somatic program, and they did performances every year. And there was this incredible performance, and it was all about shadow. It was a single performer, no big costume or anything like that. And there was a light positioned in such a way, and it was just a dance. And the person was dancing with their shadow. And when they ran away in fear, their shadow got huge and scary and ugly. And then when they came close and embraced their shadow, it was the same size as them, and it was comforting and lovely. And I just love that depiction. It was so beautiful, and it's really stood in my mind for so long. And it's a good depiction. It's a good metaphor of that work. And I think, going into shadow in some ways, doing that work will release the fear itself. But if you're bringing, this sense of compassion and kindness to the work, it's going to make it a heck of a lot easier. If we go into shadow work with the same kind of critical voice that we have in the rest of our lives, it's going to be rough. It's going to be rough.
Yeah, we're probably going to meet that same thing in the dark. It's kind of the way that tends to work, right? Our shadows tend to just reflect and magnify whatever, it is that we don't want to look at or that we're trying to hide from. And I mean, I know you've experienced that. The things that we try to avoid, they have a way of coming back to bite us in places that don't feel so good,
Yes.
especially the longer that we put them off. That's what Saturn returns are all about, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Oh
so
yeah, shadow gets bigger. The more we look away, the more we avoid it, the more we try to hide from it, it just gets bigger and louder and fiercer and uglier and gnarlier. And yeah.
totally. Um, it makes me think of the Bhagavad Gita. I love, 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 love the Gita. And there's one of my favorite lines is from chapter 5. It's a chapter about renunciation. And Krishna's telling Arjuna that a lot of people, they see the smoke and they think that it's the flame of spirit, because we're easily deceived. And he's talking about shadows, right? He's talking about the shadows that come through and that capture our attention. And it's like nobody wants to dwell in shadow all the time, right? Like my purpose and my goal in life is not to be this person immersed in shadow and darkness all the time. However, shadows become addictive. They have a tendency to kind of grip us and pull us into these loops that we have trouble escaping from. There's a reason we call it being stuck in a rut, right?
Right.
My tires kind of get in those those shadowy kind of realms. And so I found that the more that I can remind myself that these are not like scary, excuse me, these are not scary monsters on the other side of the veil, that it's more like the fool. It's trickster energy, so the more
Yeah.
that I can identify, like, oh, this isn't something that's out to get me. This is something that's just kind of playing around with me a little bit. This is the universe saying, hey, Brenton, you remember this thing that you've been saying that you want, that you've been putting off? Well, let's go. Let's get your little behind in order. Yes, it's going to feel like the world is collapsing and that you're worthless and that you're incapable of everything as you wallow on the couch for a day. But tomorrow you're going to feel a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. As I said at the very beginning, shadow is humbling and it's fertile. It's fertility. And if we approach it in that way with humility, it will actually serve us. That's what it's meant for. It's meant to serve us. It's not meant to destroy us. It's actually meant to help us evolve. We talked last episode or whatever with the garden that we can't grow seeds, sprouts, without digging in the dirt. It's literally the metaphor, the symbolism is everywhere in our life if we look to nature. And yeah, just really, recognizing that there's great learning there, there's great value, wisdom, insight. That's where it comes from. That, I've come to know that, and I think this is a Buddhist principle too, that most humans actually end up learning and growing through suffering. That's part of what shadow is. And so we humble ourselves to that. We go in recognizing that's a part of us. The yin yang symbol is a real good representation of that. So
yeah, that's whenever I think of shadow work, I immediately see that yin yang. That's what comes to my mind, which has an equal part of light in it. There is no escaping. And that's why it's so ironic. This whole episode is about shadow work, but what we're really talking about is light work. This is what it means to do light work, to shine the light on myself and others in a healing capacity.
Yeah. We can't heal. We can't grow. We can't open to receive more light without doing the shadow work.
Almost like there has to be a dark, quiet space to receive more light. Yeah.
And we can't even recognize light without darkness. I mean, right? If we're looking at the world of duality, we can't recognize light without darkness.
It's that cliche phrase. It's the bad times that make the good times feel even better. But it's true.
Right.
Yeah. So I will say that in some of this work, I found it beneficial to work on kind of befriending my shadows, kind of like coming to love your hands in the dirt as you're gardening, and being willing to just dig in and get dirt under your fingernails. The more that I found or approach this work as, how can I maybe have a cup of tea with you? How could I maybe take a
Yeah.
walk with you, my shadow, take a walk up the lane or go on a hike together? What would we talk about? Or maybe let's sit by the river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a great Rumi poem about this. I don't remember the name of it, but it's basically like, inviting and welcoming in all of these. I can't remember
The
what.
guest house.
The guest house. Yeah. And he's like, welcome them all in, as they sweep your house clean, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Ram Dass
mhm.
talks about this too. And I love that. Yeah.
So again, I also think it's kind of cool that, we've talked about how some of the roots of many of the shadows that we all experience are rooted in fear. And what we're
Mm-hmm.
really talking about as an antidote is not being afraid to do this work, because that's what we really need on a major level, on a global level. We need more people to not only do this work of stepping up and asking and looking in the mirror and saying, okay, I'm willing to receive you, me,
Yeah.
um, and I'm willing to accept you as you are, and let's kind of talk about this. Um,
I can say a little something you had mentioned before, being afraid of the dark and recognizing that, oh, there's a monster there. And then you turn the light on and it's a tree or, whatever. And I think that's really relevant to this working with this fear of shadow, which is to say that if we bring a little bit of kindness, a little bit of love, a little bit of compassion towards that part of ourselves, the monster costume melts. And what we see under it is this really, usually, most often, it's actually a really tender, young part of ourself that needs some love. Yeah, and there's so many different beautiful ways that you can do that. You can work with stuffed animals with it. We have this new practice. And that's a great way to work with it. You can work with it through art, right? Like sitting with your shadow, whatever feeling or experience that you're really struggling with, suffering, and just let it move through you in color and shape and form, and then allow it to speak back to you. Really listen. Like there's some wisdom there, yeah, and I think acceptance is a big piece too. That's sort of just reflected back to me and thinking about doing artwork with shadow. There's dance. I had mentioned that too, and
yeah, moving with shadows, totally.
yeah. There's lots of really good ways to do it, but that that real, like the humility and the sense of like, oh, everything needs kindness. Everyone needs kindness. And if we bring that to shadow, it will transform that demon, that monster into something that where, wisdom, insight, light starts to emerge from it unexpectedly. It'll blow your mind.
Totally. Yeah. It makes me think of when I was working with dreams a whole lot. Darkness in dreams
Mm.
shows up in different ways. Sometimes it's like an entirely dark room. Sometimes I've encountered people with shadows over their faces.
Mm.
And the way that I learned to interpret dreams like that was often that those shadows were just kind of hiding awareness. They were things that I was like not able to see. I wasn't able to kind of pierce that veil like the Gita talked about to see the infinity of suns behind it. That's who we really are. So I think about that sometimes, like if these shadows inside of me are really just things that I don't understand. They're not parts of me, they're inferior, unworthy, not good, and whatever. They're just parts that I don't fully understand. So if that's the case, then you're exactly right. How much wisdom is potentially inside of myself, locked in the parts of me that I don't want to have a conversation with?
Yeah.
And what would happen if we got to sit down and talk in, and what kind of things would I learn?
Yeah, there's a lot of energy trapped up in there. And I think the other piece that came to mind as you were talking is this idea too, to say that this is not masochistic. There are shadows. Shadow is and can be also protective. this goes back to what we were saying earlier, where shadow can be light and light can be shadow. So, this is not to like hold our hand in the fire. Okay. Let's have some perspective and really do a good self-assessment of like, do I need certain type of support to face this shadow? Or is this something that I need to do some surrounding, like resourcing and grounding before I face this, right? Like, don't throw yourself into the slaughterhouse. That's not what we're suggesting, right? It can be done in a way that's measurable. We want to make sure that you have the resources to move forward. You have the capacity to have compassion for yourself. You have the support for this. So there's some discernment in shadow work too.
That's really good. I'm grateful that you said that, because that's why we have therapists. That's why we have coaches. That's why we have community. That's why we have support systems. Because to take a heroic dose of mushrooms and then decide I'm going to do some shadow work is not really, honoring setting and, resources.
Totally.
So the way to bring up Gene Keys one more time, Richard talks about taking these shadows and just kind of playing with them like a cat playing with a toy sometimes. And you can kind of wrestle with them. You can get, animated, and then you can just leave them and walk away for a while. And I think that that's a really gentle and compassionate approach, because sometimes I know it's true for me when I approach self-work. I sometimes feel like I have to like get it all done as hard as possible, and I really have to get some awareness for myself. And that's not what we're talking about here, right? That's shadows.
That is shadow right there. I feel you on that one. I'm that way too. I'm like, I gotta do it. And I can burn myself out doing that. Yeah.
Ooh, the words you just said, burn out.
Totally.
Literally, it's like the light goes out. Oof, because there's nothing left. Yeah.
Yeah. We can definitely go too hard at it, and that's something to be mindful of. So it's a dance. It's a really it's a good practice in knowing yourself, trusting yourself, loving yourself, no matter what. We don't want to. I don't know if this is going to make sense. We don't want to create more shadow, try like holding ourselves to the fire, doing shadow work, right? That's not the point either.
That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, gentleness and compassion. You mentioned those two words earlier. And I think, we know. And if there are shadows that, you're trying to work with that start to feel heavy, they start to feel inflamed, then maybe those are not the right shadows to work with right now. Maybe it's something that feels a little more trickster, that's a more approachable, that feels like somebody more willing to accept an invitation to have a cup of tea than somebody who would, light that invitation on fire. We're not ready to work with those shadows yet, maybe.
Yeah.
But in that process, you mentioned them. Community is a resource. Having somebody who has resources and interventions is a resource, but also ritual, ceremony, right? These intentional practices, meditation, those are wonderful shadow work practices that can help us kind of sit with ourselves in new ways than maybe we don't normally.
Yeah, I love that you bring this up, and it keeps coming back, humility. And it's just like recognizing that we're limited as human beings, and we don't always have all the answers. So we shouldn't, with this too, think that or assume that we have all the answers in this. It's okay to find a limitation and take a step back and pause and tend to any wounds that are there and say like, oh, I wonder if somebody else has more wisdom here, or I wonder if I need more time with this, or I wonder if I need to go through a different door or look at it from a different facet or perspective. So if you meet a shadow head on and you run into a brick wall, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It's just like, oh, it's a bigger lesson, and it's like, okay, cool. I need to find another way.
Totally. Yeah. And no worries. There will be plenty of shadows to work with for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
There will be no shortage. So there's, no need to force.
Yeah. It's our lifelong journey for sure.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts about shadows or shadow work?
you brought up dreams, and I think, and we were talking about symbolism too, and I think that can be a really good way to work with it, kind of indirectly. And ritual, these are all really good ways to work with shadow indirectly, in even art as it peers back to us. And sometimes that's the way. Head on, it, isn't always the way. Sometimes it is necessary to really be very raw with it. And sometimes it's like, I'm just going to look at it as a scan. So it's no longer here out of my sight of vision. It's just there, and the magic of symbolism and myth and metaphor is working on us with regards to the shadow. And that's that, that humility and that recognition that there's forces outside of ourselves, other people, other beings that have a little bit more to offer around that.
Yeah, well said. Because really what we're talking about, this work is alchemy. This is soul alchemy.
Yeah.
This is magic. Like, this is the real stuff.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
Totally. I'm so glad that you used that word. It is alchemy. Yep. Turning base metals into gold and gold into base metals, because it's all, we need it all.
Totally. Yeah. We can go to lead to gold and back again. And what perfect analogies for light and shadow than shimmery gold and, dark lead. Goodness.
Right. Yeah.
It's all just alchemy, Rachelle.
Mm-hmm.